Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to really explore this fascinating little snapshot of a gardener's mind. And through that, we're going to unpack the actual mechanics of how inspiration and curiosity function.
Right. It's a really great piece we're looking at today.
Yeah, we are looking at a very short, highly personal horticultural journal entry. It was actually published today, Jan 28, 2026, by a writer named Ang.
And the title is Notes on Gardening, Part 939, Rediscovering the Orchid Tree.
Right. Or if you want the botanical name, it's Bauhinia variegata. And we're going to break down the sheer biological paradox of this specific tree, the cognitive science of why it stops people in their tracks, and really just the timeline of how a casual hobbyist transitions into like a deliberate cultivator.
Exactly. And I mean, it's a brief excerpt from a larger work, which is called The Orchid Tree, a horticultural reevaluation, but it serves as this perfect case study
Oh, absolutely.
because it documents that highly recognizable experience of just, having your daily routine completely derailed by something unexpectedly beautiful.
And I mean, we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
You were just in the absolute thick of the mundane,
Oh, yeah. Autopilot.
totally on autopilot.
Yeah.
You've got your mental checklist going like drop off the dry cleaning, grab the specific brand of oat milk, beat the traffic light. Your brain is operating just to navigate the friction of everyday errands.
Right. You're not looking for wonder.
No, not at all. And then, out of nowhere, you see something that completely shatters that utilitarian headspace. Ang actually begins this entry by describing the distinct joy of encountering exotic plants by the roadside while running those exact kinds of errands.
It's a great phrase, distinct joy.
It really is. And specifically, Ang notes how the vibrant magenta and pink blooms of this orchid tree, well, they captivate the eye all over again.
Which brings us straight to the biological contradiction that makes this specific tree so arresting.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does, because Ang notes the sheer brilliance of the petals, pointing out that they possess the striking look of an exotic orchid. And here is the core of the paradox. This isn't a delicate potted plant. It grows as a beautifully canopied tree under the full sun.
Yeah, under the full, unyielding sun. And if we look at how those two things normally operate in nature, it almost feels like a glitch,
A biological glitch.
Yeah. Because, I mean, orchids in the strict botanical sense, they're generally epiphytes. They grow on other plants, usually tucked away under the dense canopy of a rainforest somewhere.
Safe from the harsh elements.
Right. They rely on high humidity, ambient moisture, highly specific filtered light. Their entire cellular structure is designed for a protected environment.
Yes, from their specialized roots right down to their delicate petals.
Exactly. So when you see those highly specialized finicky features just like scaled up and blooming on a massive canopy tree baking in the harsh sun, it naturally scrambles the brain a bit. It's like finding a delicate, rare, stained glass window built into the side of a rugged skyscraper.
Oh, I love that analogy. What's fascinating here is how that visual paradox actually works on our minds. Eng's description captures the essence of botanical wonder perfectly.
It really pulls you in.
It does. Because to use another analogy, it is very much like taking the front-end user interface of a highly specialized, fragile piece of custom software.
Like the delicate orchid bloom.
Right, and porting it directly onto a massive, universally compatible operating system, which is the canopy tree.
Wow. Yeah.
Because the Bauhinia variegata is actually a member of the legume family. It's a workhorse of a tree. It has this deep, aggressive taproot system.
Just to pull water from way underground.
Exactly. And thick bark to prevent moisture loss, plus a robust vascular system that can handle the high transpiration rates you need to survive in full sun.
But it just happens to have evolved flowers that mimic the bilateral symmetry of an orchid.
Yes, to attract very specific pollinators.
So it has the aesthetic code of the rainforest, but the hardware of a street tree. That's just a brilliant way to understand it.
And it explains why Ang experiences that distinct joy.
Right, because it's not just that the flower is a pretty shade of pink. It is the cognitive friction of seeing two completely different evolutionary strategies merged into one plant.
Precisely. I mean, in psychology, there is this concept regarding how our brains categorize visual input. We build schemas.
Like mental shortcuts.
Exactly. We have a schema for tough, sun-baked street tree and a completely different schema for delicate tropical orchid.
And when we're driving down the street on autopilot,
Our brain is just pattern matching. It ignores things that fit our expected schemas to save energy. But when an environment presents a visual anomaly that blurs those two distinct
it
categories,
forces you to stop.
yes, it triggers an involuntary orienting response. The brain literally has to pause its background processing and allocate conscious bandwidth to resolve the anomaly.
And we experience that sudden cognitive friction as awe, or, like Aang puts it, joy.
Yes. And as a dedicated hobbyist, Aang is uniquely primed to experience that friction.
For sure. I mean, if I'm driving past it, I might just see a nice pink tree and think, are pretty.
Right.
But Aang understands the underlying biology. That makes the sight of an orchid-like flower thriving in an exposed canopy almost structurally offensive, you know? It breaks the rules.
It does, which is why it commands attention so thoroughly.
Okay, let's unpack this, though. If the visual impact of this tree is so staggering and it breaks all these botanical rules, why didn't Aang just take a cutting right then and there the very first time they saw it?
Ah, that is the big question.
Right, because that hesitance actually reveals a lot about the timeline of a gardener. And we see this in a really fascinating detail dropped into the text. Aang mentions that this isn't their first time being captivated by this specific tree.
No, it isn't.
Today's post is part 939. But Aang casually notes that they first stumbled upon this plant, quote, so many moons ago, way back in part 420.
That gap is arguably the most revealing part of the entire journal entry.
It's massive. That's over 500 distinct journal entries. Assuming Aang writes somewhat regularly, that is a huge amount of time. Why do you think a dedicated hobbyist lets the one that got away slip by for so long, only to be tempted to source it now?
Well, it is tempting to write it off as simple distraction, especially given the sheer volume of plants a dedicated gardener interacts with every season.
Right, my immediate thought was, did Aang just procrastinate?
But if you look closely at Aang's phrasing from that older entry, it points to something far more deliberate. Back in part 420, Aang explicitly notes that they decided not to get a specimen for evaluation purposes at that time.
Evaluation purposes, that's a very specific phrase.
It is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It indicates that Aang's engagement with plants isn't just about passive collection. Gardening is a long game.
Yeah, because evaluating a full canopy tree is a completely different logistical nightmare compared to evaluating, say, a new species of basil in a pot on your patio.
Exactly. Horticultural evaluation at that scale requires significant resources. You aren't just looking at the flowers.
You're looking at the whole ecosystem impact.
Right. You are testing its hardiness zone tolerance, monitoring how its roots interact with local soil pH, observing whether its canopy will shade out existing understory plants.
Tracking drought tolerance over years.
Yes. So when Aang saw the tree at part 420, it's highly likely they just lacked the physical space, the microclimate, or frankly the foundational expertise required to properly evaluate a fast-growing, full-sun legume tree.
So it wasn't forgotten at all. It was just filed away because the infrastructure, physical or mental, wasn't there yet.
Precisely. In cognitive science, this mirrors the spacing effect, though applied on a macro scale.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, we learn and internalize complex concepts far better when our exposure to them is spaced out over long intervals. It allows the brain to build surrounding context in the meantime.
So Aang at part 420 registered the anomaly of the orchid tree. And then over the next 500 entries,
Aang presumably evaluated dozens of other plants, dealt with different soils, mastered new propagation techniques, and refined their understanding of canopy dynamics.
got it. So when the re-encounter happens today at part 939, Aang isn't starting from scratch.
Exactly. They are bringing a much more sophisticated mental framework to the exact same plant. The curiosity sat dormant, but the capacity to act on it caught up. The second exposure was the catalyst.
That makes a lot of sense. The curiosity doesn't expire. And spotting those magenta blooms on a random errand, it finally moves this plant from the theoretical filing cabinet into active production.
And you see the text shift entirely in this last section.
Oh yeah, it goes from a diary of aesthetic appreciation straight into tactical planning. Aang is now, quote, rather tempted to source one.
This is the critical threshold. It's where the passive admirer becomes the active cultivator. And the internal negotiation Aang goes through here is fascinating.
So let's break that negotiation down, because I actually found Aang's decision here a bit surprising.
Really? How so?
Well, Aang admits to looking at the roadside plant and considering harvesting seeds or taking cuttings right there on the spot. But they decide against it, noting that they were on their way to other errands.
Right, the reality of the mundane intrudes again.
Exactly. And Ang says that even if they encounter it again, they're going to opt for a live plant instead. And this decision is based purely on, quote, what I've read. They plan to source this live plant during an upcoming field trip to some plant centers or nurseries.
It perfectly highlights the tension between the romantic impulse of gardening and the pragmatic reality of botany.
So what does this all mean for us? It's kind of like a baker deciding whether to mill their own flour from scratch, like gathering seeds or cuttings from the wild, versus just going to a high-end bakery to buy the finished cake.
That's a great way to put it.
But isn't deciding to just go buy a fully grown plant the lazy way out? Especially for someone on their 939th journal entry. There's this narrative in the hobbyist community that true mastery means foraging a wild cutting, rooting it yourself, and nurturing it.
That is a very common perspective, and it is exactly why Eng's decision here reflects a really mature approach to learning.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, the impulse to take a cutting from a beautiful wild specimen is incredibly strong. It's the ultimate origin story for a garden. But let's look at the actual biological mechanics of propagating a woody canopy tree like Bauhinia variegata from a cutting.
It's not just snipping a leaf and putting it in a glass of water on the windowsill, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
If you take a woody cutting from a mature tree, you are immediately racing against a biological clock.
Right.
The moment you sever that stem, the leaves continue to transpire, they continue to lose moisture to the air. But the branch no longer has the tree's root pressure to pull replacement water up.
So it just dries out immediately.
Pretty much. Within hours or even minutes on a hot day, air bubbles can form in the vascular tissue. It's a process called embolism, and it permanently blocks water transport.
Oh, wow. I had no idea it was that sensitive.
Yeah, so to successfully root a tree cutting, you typically need sterile shears, specific rooting hormones, careful node selection.
You probably need to get it right into some kind of humidity dome to stop the transpiration.
Exactly. You have to halt transpiration while new roots form.
And Ang was on the way to run errands. I mean, you can't exactly maintain a sterile, high-humidity propagation environment in the cup holder of your car while sitting in traffic.
Precisely. Ang recognizes the logistical impossibility of that moment.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when Ang says they wouldn't take a cutting even if they saw it again? That they'd rather buy a live plant based on what I've read.
Right. In horticulture, many commercially available trees are actually grafted.
Okay.
Nurseries will take the scion, the top part of the plant that produces those beautiful, specific orchid-like flowers, and graft it onto the rootstock of a related but much hardier, disease-resistant variety.
So by reading up on the species, Ang realized a wild cutting might just be a bad idea overall.
Exactly. They likely discovered that a wild-grown cutting might struggle with local soil pathogens, or just lack the vigor of a professionally cultivated specimen.
So bypassing the romantic roadside foraging isn't a cop-out at all. It's an informed, tactical choice. You're prioritizing the actual survival of the plant over the ego of propagating it from scratch.
That is exactly what is happening. Ang is balancing the spontaneous enthusiasm of that initial encounter with deliberate, researched execution. And you see that balance perfectly encapsulated in Ang's phrasing. They describe the planned nursery visit as a field trip.
I noticed that too. Field trip is such a specific phrase.
It is, right? It retains this childlike, open-ended curiosity of discovery, but it applies it to a highly structured, intentional excursion.
Right, acknowledging that the thrill of acquiring the plant doesn't disappear just because the method is practical.
Exactly.
It maps the entire anatomy of an inspiration so cleanly. We start with the friction of daily life, interrupted by this cognitive shock of an orchid bloom on a canopy tree.
A biological paradox.
Yeah. And then we see how that shock is absorbed, filed away for hundreds of journal entries while the gardener builds the capacity to handle it. And finally, the dormant curiosity awakens, bypasses the trap of ill-advised foraging, and results in a researched field trip.
It is a remarkable journey to extract from such a brief piece of writing. It shows that inspiration isn't just a lightning strike, you know? It's a process.
Yeah, process of recognizing an anomaly and then doing the quiet, structural work required to actually integrate it into your life.
Very well said.
Which leaves us with something really compelling to think about regarding our own routines. For everyone listening right now, as you're navigating your own checklists and commutes, what orchid trees are you passing by?
What anomalies are out there?
Exactly. What beautiful, rule-breaking things have triggered that cognitive friction for you, but are currently just sitting in your own mental version of Part 420, waiting for you to build the capacity to evaluate them?
That's a great question. And if I may, there is one final tension in this text worth leaving you with to mull over.
Oh, please do.
Aang writes beautifully about the distinct joy of serendipitously encountering these blooms in the wild. The sheer brilliance captivates the eye precisely because it is unexpected, because it breaks the visual schema of a mundane errand.
Right, it's the surprise that makes it so joyful.
But Aang's stated goal now is to buy a live specimen, bring it home, and cultivate it for evaluation purposes.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The question is, does capturing the exotic, bringing it out of the wild margins of the roadside, and placing it into a controlled domestic space where you expect to see it every single day, does that fundamentally change the very nature of that spontaneous, captivating joy we feel when we first stumble upon it?
Wow. If you domesticate the anomaly, does it stop being an anomaly?
Exactly.
Does it lose the ability to cause that awe-inducing cognitive friction once it just becomes a planned part of your own backyard? That is definitely something to chew on the next time you are stuck at a traffic light, looking at the trees on the side of the road, wondering which ones are breaking the rules.